Welcome to the Upriver Crawfish. I'm your host, Sankara. Today we'll be talking about weapons and tactics. It's a new series in which I will present weapons and discuss and analyze how they are employed in combat. On today's series, we'll be talking about the BMPT-72 Terminator 2. It's a beast of a weapon created by the Russians. It is the Russian cue to urban warfare. Before we get into the discussion about the weapon in particular, I would like to go back and give some history as to what caused the Russians to think about creating this weapon. So let's do that. The saying goes that necessity is the mother of all invention. Given that, let's go back to 1994, December of 1994 to be exact, the first Chechen War. Chechen nationalists decided to secede from Russia. And then President Boris Yeltsin decided to put an end to that rebellion. So Russian forces were sent into Chechnya to go and end the rebellion. Russian forces at that time were suffering from the effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were poorly trained conscripts, poor leadership, pretty much atrophy of the military. So the Russians went into Chechnya not thinking that the Chechens would put up a fight. And when they got there, they were wrong. The Chechens did put up a fight. The Russian forces went into Grozny to capture the capital city of Chechnya, Grozny, with tanks and columns, armor, armored fighting vehicles, tanks. Basically, they pretty much show how not to fight urban warfare. They had neglected small unit tactics due to the Afghan war as well. So Russian forces got bogged down. They entered Grozny, to be exact, but they met a Chechen force that was very tough, trained, capable, not like the poorly trained conscripts that the Russians had. Chechen forces were led by Colonel Aslan Maskadov. Chechens would have had a configuration of like 20 man teams that ambushed the Russian forces. The tanks couldn't. One of the things that the tactics the Chechens used were to go either at the top of the buildings or at the bottom of the buildings in the basements, so as to be able to escape the blast from the tanks. The tanks became pretty much useless, as is the case in urban warfare. The Russians lost a lot of men. One particular unit that it's is storied about the annihilation was the 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade. That unit was decimated. They were so confused, and some of the conscripts, the poorly trained conscripts, were so afraid that some of them thought that they would seek protection in their tanks. And as a result of that, Some of them died in their tanks. The tanks became the coffin for them. So, nevertheless, the Russians did finally take over Grozny, and over time in the Second Chechen War, they were finally able to pacify Chechnya. But the Russian learned a painful lesson in there. To be frank, the Russians, I would say the Russians weren't so much as learning a new lesson as that they neglected the lessons of urban warfare. So that's where the idea for the BMPT started. So based on the Chechen War, the experience from the Chechen War, the Russians came up with the BMPT-72. BMPT in Russian stands for Tank Support Vehicle. This is specifically created for not just supporting tanks, but supporting tanks in urban warfare. The BMPT-72 is armed with 2 autocannons, and then it has 4 anti-tank weapons. Now, those autocannons are important. They bring a lot of firepower. Remember, in Chechnya, the rebels would go at the top of the buildings and at the bottom to use their RPG-7 to destroy Russian armor. So those autocannons allow them to engage troops and tanks. The Russians use 2 configurations for the BMPT. In urban warfare, the Russians use 2 BMPTs per tank. Whereas if they're fighting on the steppes, as in the case of possibly Ukraine, if we believe the West, it will be 1 BMPT per tank. Those are the configurations in which they use the BMPT. Now, of course, having a weapon is one thing, but it is important with the tactics that you use for the weapons. If your tactics are not good, your weapon is almost useless. So in urban warfare, as the Chechen War will show, that the Chechens utilized the RPG-7, which is an anti-tank weapon. And one of the ways to defeat the anti-tank weapon is using an effective small unit tactics. What do I mean by that? So rather than taking tanks into the city, into the heart of the city, tanks are used to control the macro space. And troops, small unit troops, platoons, squads, they go ahead of the tanks and do mopping up and fight. They do the fighting. Now, when you're the defender and you have to worry about troops coming at you, shooting at you, and you have to shoot at them, it makes it tougher for you to try to look for a tank, especially one that may be far, where you have to take your time to aim. So small unit tactics tend to undo things like anti-tank weapons. It's one of the reasons why the javelin that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine is pretty much going to be useless. It will be useless. It will have very little, if any, effect on combat if Russia was trying to invade Ukraine. Because even when the Ukrainians fought the separatists, they didn't use tanks. The Ukrainians were the one that were using tanks. But coming back to the tactics, how the Russians will employ this is that the troops will be ahead. The troops will be the one going and seeking and closing in with the enemy to destroy the enemy. The tanks will take care of the macro space. So at the approaches, maybe at the intersections, places that allow tanks to maneuver, those are where the tanks will be. The BMPT in the urban warfare with the Russians, they will use it in a tandem wherein you have one BMPT, then a tank, and then one BMPT, with the tank being in the middle, probably in the stagger. And this part is speculation, probably in the stagger formation, so that the leading BMPT can probe further into the micro space if needed. The tank in the macro space will be able to hit at sniper nests, and the BMPT also in the macro space will the second BMPT will protect the tanks from troops. So they will be able to engage troops. So basically, the BMPT, the effective use of the BMPT with small unit tactics going into urban combat will solve it becomes a cure for urban warfare. Obviously, the men have to fight, but again, if you have good tactics, brave men, good weapons, you'll be able to. That shouldn't be a problem. If let's take the situation of Ukraine. If they were using the situation with Ukraine, if they're in the steppes, the BMPT, they're in the open field, they'll be firing long ahead, and the tanks themselves can see any threat. So it's not going to be much of an issue. But I want to also show you guys a footage of U.S. Marines in Fallujah. This will show you how small unit tactics is used. You will notice there ain't many tanks there. These guys are on the ground fighting. That's how war is won. So they're going to have to fight on the ground. And so this is what you're going to see here. Right? So, as I stated, using small unit tactics, these guys in the macro space, the micro space, U.S. tanks outside of the macro space, they're in the macro space. And that's the reason why the U.S. didn't lose a lot of tanks in Fallujah, as much tanks in Fallujah, because these guys go ahead, the grunts go ahead and seize the buildings. They will do the fighting. The defenders have to contend with them. The tanks will give them cover. Or will be like an overwatch to give them cover. I miss this stuff. Yeah. So that's how the Russians will fight. So let's come back again and bring it in do a recap. The Russians using the BMPT will use it in tandem with the tanks. They're also going to employ proper small unit tactics in an urban environment situation like the face in Chechnya. The troops will go ahead into the microspace, they would seize the buildings, and they're the one who would close in and destroy the enemy. By the way, that's a small. That weapon he's about to use is called a small. Shoulder launched multi-purpose something weapon. It's a small. Yeah, those are some of the weapons that my unit used. But so the troops will take the microspace. The tanks and the BMPT will operate in the microspace, in a bigger, or further from between the streets. Maybe they will be in approaches, and probably around. You see where they are. For example, they drop the troops areas where there's not problem, and then the troops will go ahead. But the tank and the BMPT will stay behind. They will be able to take out the sniper nest and provide supporting fire. The BMPT protecting the tanks, and the one ahead, the BMPT that is ahead of the tanks will provide the troops with more firepower when needed. All right. That's it for Weapons and Tactics, BMPT-72 Terminator 2. Thank you. Please like, subscribe, by all means comment, and share. Thank you.